She built an entire career on kindness. For more than 25 years, Leanne Morgan was told she was too clean, too wholesome, too relatable to ever become one of comedy's biggest stars. Critics dismissed her style. Industry insiders overlooked her. Yet somehow, the woman they underestimated kept selling out theaters, filling arenas, and winning over millions of fans without changing who she was. So when Leanne Morgan walked onto The View, nobody expected fireworks. The conversation started exactly the way everyone imagined it would. There were smiles, compliments, laughter, and warm introductions. Joy Behar praised Leanne's incredible rise to success, celebrated her loyal fan base, and made it seem like this would be another friendly celebrity interview. But then, something changed. Without warning, the mood shifted. One unexpected question turned a light-hearted conversation into a tense confrontation that no one in the studio saw coming. What began as a celebration of Leanne's career quickly became a heated argument over comedy, respect, and what it really takes to earn success. The audience watched in complete disbelief as the exchange grew more personal with every passing moment. The other hosts struggled to hide their reactions. Suddenly, what was supposed to be an ordinary interview became one of the most talked-about moments of the day. And then came the moment that left everyone stunned. Instead of staying silent or trying to smooth things over, Leanne decided she had heard enough. What happened next completely changed the direction of the interview and left viewers debating who had really crossed the line. Was Joy Behar simply asking tough questions? Or had the interview gone too far? And did Leanne Morgan make the right decision by refusing to let the conversation continue on someone else's terms? Stay with us, because this story takes several unexpected turns, and by the end, you'll understand why people couldn't stop talking about what happened after Leanne Morgan faced off with Joy Behar on The View. For Leanne Morgan, success didn't happen overnight. It wasn't the kind of career built on viral moments, Hollywood connections, or instant fame. Long before sold-out arenas, best-selling books, and television success, she was performing anywhere she could find an audience. Small comedy clubs, community events, local theaters. If there was a microphone and a few people willing to listen, Leanne was there, refining a style that would eventually make her one of America's most recognizable comedians. What made her different wasn't controversy or shock value. While many comedians chased headlines by pushing boundaries, Leanne built her reputation by talking about everyday life. Family, marriage, parenting, growing older, and the hilarious moments that every ordinary person experiences became the heart of her comedy. Her stories felt authentic, and audiences responded because they saw themselves in them. Over the years, millions of people embraced that approach. Families attended her shows together. Parents brought their adult children. Grandparents laughed alongside grandchildren. Fans often described her performances as something they could enjoy without worrying about uncomfortable surprises. In an entertainment industry that often rewarded controversy, Leanne proved there was still a massive audience for warmth, honesty, and relatable humor. That success eventually brought her to one of daytime television's biggest stages, The View. Appearing on the program was another milestone in a career that had been built through patience, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to staying true to herself. As the interview began, everything seemed exactly as viewers expected. The conversation was relaxed and cheerful. Joy Behar welcomed Leanne with compliments about her growing popularity, her successful projects, and the remarkable journey that had brought her to national attention. The other hosts joined in, laughing along as Leanne shared stories in her signature down-to-earth style. The audience responded warmly. Every joke landed. Every answer felt genuine. The atmosphere suggested that this would be another memorable but friendly conversation between accomplished women in entertainment. For several minutes, nothing seemed out of place. Leanne appeared comfortable, smiling as she answered questions and thanked everyone for supporting her career. Joy seemed equally welcoming, nodding along and praising the comedian's ability to connect with audiences across the country. To anyone watching, it looked like the interview would continue exactly that way until the closing segment. But appearances can be deceiving. Sometimes the biggest turning points don't arrive with raised voices or obvious warning signs. Sometimes they begin with a single question that changes everything. As the conversation continued, Joy's tone subtly shifted. The smiles remained, but the questions started feeling different. What had begun as a celebration of Leanne's remarkable career slowly transformed into something far more uncomfortable. Within moments, the cheerful atmosphere that had filled the studio would disappear, setting the stage for a confrontation that neither the audience nor the other hosts seemed prepared to witness. What happened next would completely change the direction of the interview and leave viewers arguing about it long after the cameras stopped rolling. For the first several minutes, everything unfolded exactly as anyone would have expected. The conversation flowed naturally, with Leanne Morgan answering questions about her career, her growing popularity, and the experiences that had shaped her journey in comedy. She spoke with the same warmth that had earned her millions of loyal fans, sharing stories with an easy smile and the kind of humor that made people feel as though they were sitting in a living room talking with an old friend. Joy Behar appeared completely engaged. She laughed at Leanne's stories, complimented her success, and acknowledged the remarkable path that had taken her from performing in small venues to becoming one of the biggest names in stand-up comedy. The audience responded enthusiastically, applauding after nearly every exchange. Even the other hosts seemed relaxed, enjoying the conversation as it unfolded. There was nothing to suggest that the mood was about to change. Then, almost without warning, Joy's expression became noticeably more serious. The friendly rhythm of the interview slowed, and instead of moving to another lighthearted topic, she paused for a moment before introducing a completely different line of discussion. She acknowledged that Leanne's comedy had attracted a massive audience, but questioned whether its clean, family-friendly style truly belonged among the industry's most respected forms of comedy. She suggested that some critics viewed Leanne's material as entertaining, but lacking the edge often associated with legendary stand-up performers. The question immediately altered the atmosphere. Only seconds earlier, the audience had been laughing together. Now the room seemed noticeably quieter as people waited to hear how Leanne would respond. The energy shifted from celebration to uncertainty, and even the other hosts appeared caught off guard by the sudden change in direction. Leanne didn't interrupt. She listened carefully, maintaining the calm smile that audiences had come to recognize over the years. Rather than reacting emotionally, she appeared to consider every word before speaking, giving no indication that the unexpected criticism had unsettled her. That composure only made the moment more dramatic. Joy continued explaining her point, suggesting that many people believe truly great comedy challenged audiences, pushed boundaries, and sparked uncomfortable conversations. By comparison, she implied that Leanne's style focused more on making audiences feel comfortable than on redefining the art of comedy itself. The question wasn't just about jokes anymore. It had become a discussion about credibility, artistic value, and whether one of the country's most successful comedians truly deserved the recognition she had earned. Across the studio, the mood remained tense. The laughter had disappeared, replaced by complete attention as everyone waited to see whether Leanne would simply brush the comment aside or answer it directly. No one knew it yet, but this single exchange had changed the course of the interview. What had started as a routine celebrity appearance was quickly becoming a deeply personal debate, and the calm atmosphere from only moments earlier was beginning to fade. The conversation was no longer about promoting a career. It was becoming a battle over respect, reputation, and the very definition of success. For a brief moment after Joy finished speaking, the studio seemed to stand still. The audience waited. The other hosts remained quiet. Everyone seemed to expect Leanne Morgan to respond the way many guests on live television often do. Offer a polite laugh, give a carefully worded answer, and steer the conversation back to safer territory. But that wasn't what happened. Leanne kept the same calm expression she'd worn since the interview began. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look angry. Instead, she smiled softly, took a moment to gather her thoughts, and answered with the kind of confidence that only comes from years of believing in your own work. She explained that she had heard similar criticism throughout her career. People had often told her that she was too clean, too traditional, or too focused on everyday family life. For years, she had listened as others insisted audiences wanted something louder, edgier, or more controversial. Yet every prediction about her career had turned out to be wrong. She pointed out that despite all the criticism, people continued buying tickets. Families continued filling theaters. Her audience kept growing year after year, not because she followed trends, but because she stayed true to the kind of comedian she always wanted to be. Then Leanne shifted the conversation in a direction few people expected. Rather than focusing only on the criticism itself, she questioned why the tone of the interview had changed so suddenly. Only moments earlier, the discussion had been filled with compliments and laughter. Now the conversation seemed centered on defending her entire career. To Leanne, that abrupt shift felt impossible to ignore. She calmly observed that there was a clear difference between asking a challenging question and creating a situation where someone was expected to defend their life's work. Her words were measured, but they carried unmistakable weight. She explained that honest conversations were always welcome. Every performer understands that criticism comes with success. But criticism, she suggested, should come from a genuine desire to understand, not from assumptions about what comedy should or shouldn't be. As she continued speaking, the audience became noticeably more engaged. Several people nodded in agreement. The room remained silent, not because anyone was uncomfortable, but because every sentence seemed to pull people further into the conversation. The cheerful interview had transformed into something much deeper, a discussion about respect, authenticity, and the value of staying true to yourself. The other hosts watched carefully, allowing Leanne the space to finish without interruption. Even they appeared surprised by how confidently she had responded. Leanne made it clear that she wasn't interested in arguing for the sake of creating drama. She wasn't trying to win a debate. She simply wanted one thing: to remind everyone that success doesn't have to look the same for every comedian. Some performers choose controversy. Others choose storytelling. Some rely on shock. Others rely on connection. Neither approach automatically makes one artist more legitimate than another. That simple point resonated throughout the studio. The audience, which had been uncertain only minutes earlier, now seemed fully invested in what Leanne had to say. The balance of the conversation had quietly begun to shift. Instead of looking like a guest caught off guard by an unexpected challenge, Leanne appeared completely in control of herself. And as Joy prepared to respond, it became increasingly clear that the discussion was no longer just about comedy. It had become a conversation about recognition, respect, and whether success should be measured by critics, or by the millions of people whose lives are touched by the work itself. Leanne paused for a moment before continuing, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different kind of emotion. It wasn't the emotion of someone trying to win an argument. It was the emotion of someone explaining why she had spent an entire career refusing to become someone she wasn't. She explained that people often misunderstood the purpose of her comedy. To some critics, clean comedy sounded simple. They assumed that avoiding controversial subjects somehow made the job easier. But Leanne saw it completely differently. She said that making people laugh without relying on shock, insults, or constant controversy required its own kind of creativity. Every joke had to stand on its own. Every story had to connect because it was genuine, not because it was designed to provoke a reaction. For Leanne, comedy had never been about dividing a room. It had always been about bringing one together. She reflected on the audiences she had met over the years. People from small towns and big cities. Parents who finally found a night to themselves after months of hard work. Grandparents bringing their grown children to a show. Entire families sitting side by side, laughing at the same stories, even though they came from different generations. Those moments, she explained, meant far more to her than any headline or glowing review. She said there was something special about watching 3 generations laugh together at the same joke. In a world where people disagreed about almost everything, those few hours inside a theater became one place where everyone could simply enjoy themselves without feeling judged. That, in her view, was the real achievement. Leanne continued by saying she had received countless letters and messages over the years from people who had attended her performances during some of the hardest periods of their lives. Some had recently lost loved ones. Others were struggling with financial hardship, illness, or personal challenges. Many simply wanted a reason to smile again after carrying the weight of everyday life. She explained that those stories stayed with her long after the applause ended. Awards were wonderful. Sold-out shows were unforgettable. But knowing that her work had helped someone forget their worries for a little while, that was the success she valued most. The audience listened in complete silence. No one interrupted. Every sentence felt deeply personal, and the sincerity behind her words made it difficult to dismiss what she was saying. Leanne acknowledged that not every comedian had the same mission. She respected performers who chose different styles and different audiences. Comedy was a broad art form, and there was room for many different voices. But she believed the same respect should be extended in return. Just because one comedian built a career through bold social commentary didn't mean another comedian, who focused on everyday family life, deserved less recognition. Different audiences needed different kinds of laughter. Different experiences produced different stories. Neither approach erased the value of the other. As she explained her philosophy, the atmosphere inside the studio continued to change. People who had initially expected a simple disagreement were now watching something much more meaningful unfold. This was no longer just a debate over jokes. It had become a conversation about purpose, about why entertainers step onto a stage in the first place. Some hope to challenge ideas, some hope to spark discussion, and others simply hope to make someone's difficult day a little brighter. Leanne made it clear that she had always chosen the third path. She said she never set out to prove she was the boldest comedian in the room. She never measured success by how uncomfortable she could make an audience feel. Instead, she measured it by the smiles she saw when people left the theater, the families who returned together year after year, and the messages from people who said laughter had helped them through moments they never thought they would survive. As those words settled over the studio, the audience's reaction spoke for itself. The applause grew louder than it had at any point earlier in the interview. It wasn't simply appreciation for a clever response. It was recognition that Leanne had transformed a question about comedy into something much larger. A reminder that making people laugh, giving them hope, and helping them forget their burdens, even for a short time, could be every bit as meaningful as any other form of entertainment. And with the audience now firmly behind her, it became clear that the conversation was moving in a direction no one had anticipated when the interview first began. Leanne allowed the applause to settle before speaking again. Her expression remained calm, but there was a quiet determination in her voice that made every word feel deliberate. She explained that what many people saw today was only the final chapter of a story that had taken decades to write. Success, she said, has a way of making people forget everything that came before it. They see the sold-out theaters. They see the television appearances. They see the best-selling book, the successful comedy specials, and the growing fan base. What they don't see are the years when almost nobody knew her name. Leanne reflected on the beginning of her career, when every opportunity had to be earned one performance at a time. There were nights when the audiences were small, venues where only a handful of people showed up, and long drives home wondering if all the effort would ever amount to anything. Still, she kept going. Not because someone promised success. Not because the industry told her she was the future of comedy. She kept going because she believed in what she was doing. She admitted there were moments when people encouraged her to completely change her act. Some suggested becoming more controversial. Others believed she needed to abandon the stories about family and everyday life in favor of material that would attract more attention. Again and again, she heard the same advice. If you want to make it, you need to be different. But every time she considered changing, she came back to the same conclusion. If she had to become someone else to succeed, then whatever success followed wouldn't really belong to her. So she stayed exactly who she was. Year after year, she continued telling stories that reflected her own life, trusting that somewhere there were audiences who wanted honesty more than controversy. For a long time, that decision wasn't rewarded. Recognition came slowly. There were years when it seemed like everyone else was moving ahead while she remained in the background, quietly working without much attention from critics or industry insiders. But instead of giving up, she focused on improving. Every performance became another chance to learn. Every audience taught her something new about timing, storytelling, and connecting with people. She reminded everyone that careers aren't built through one big moment. They're built through thousands of small moments that nobody remembers. The early mornings, the late nights, the endless travel, the disappointments, the performances that went well, the ones that didn't. Those experiences, she explained, shaped her far more than success ever could. Leanne then turned the conversation back toward Joy's earlier criticism. She said it was easy for people to look at someone after they've become successful and assume the journey must have been simple. What many fail to realize is that surviving 25 years in entertainment requires resilience that can't be measured by awards or headlines. There are countless talented people who never make it that far. Not because they lacked ability, because they eventually became exhausted by constant rejection. Leanne said she understood that feeling. She had experienced moments of doubt just like everyone else. Moments when opportunities disappeared. Moments when doors closed. Moments when it seemed easier to walk away. But every setback reminded her why she had started in the first place. She wasn't chasing fame. She wasn't trying to impress critics. She simply wanted to make people laugh. That purpose never changed. The audience listened carefully as she described the difference between temporary popularity and lasting trust. Popularity can appear overnight. Trust takes years. Her audience had trusted her for decades because she had never pretended to be someone she wasn't. They knew exactly what they would get every time they attended one of her shows. Authenticity, warmth, stories that reflected real life. She explained that building that relationship with millions of people wasn't luck. It wasn't an accident. It was the result of consistently showing up, year after year, and earning that trust one performance at a time. As her words settled over the room, the atmosphere became noticeably more reflective. Even those who had remained silent throughout the discussion seemed to recognize that the conversation had moved far beyond a disagreement about comedy styles. It was now about perseverance, about believing in yourself long enough for the rest of the world to finally notice. Leanne finished the thought with quiet confidence. She said that if someone spends 25 years building something with honesty and hard work, no single interview, no single opinion, and no single critic has the power to erase that journey. The audience responded with another wave of applause. Not because she had raised her voice, not because she had delivered a dramatic speech, but because every word reflected the reality of a career built patiently, one step at a time. And by now, it was becoming increasingly clear that this conversation was no longer following the path anyone had expected when the interview first began. By this point, the conversation had become far more than a discussion about one comedian's career. It had evolved into a debate over the very purpose of comedy itself. Joy listened carefully before responding. She acknowledged Leanne's years of hard work, but suggested that the discussion wasn't about dedication. In her view, the question was whether comedy should do more than simply entertain. She argued that throughout history, many of the most celebrated comedians had challenged audiences, questioned society, and forced people to confront uncomfortable ideas. According to Joy, great comedy wasn't always supposed to leave people feeling comfortable. Sometimes it was meant to make them think. Sometimes it was supposed to spark debate. Sometimes it even made people uncomfortable before it made them laugh. Her comments weren't delivered with anger, but they carried enough conviction to keep the tension in the room alive. The audience listened closely, realizing that neither woman seemed willing to step away from her position. Leanne nodded respectfully before answering. She made it clear that she wasn't dismissing that style of comedy. There had always been performers who used humor to explore serious issues, and she believed there was absolutely room for that approach. But she questioned why that had to be considered the only definition of meaningful comedy. She explained that laughter itself has value. Not every audience arrives carrying the same expectations. Some people attend a comedy show hoping to hear sharp observations about current events. Others simply want to forget about their worries for a little while. Neither choice, she argued, should be treated as less important than the other. Leanne said that life already gives people enough difficult moments. Many families spend their days worrying about work, paying bills, caring for loved ones, or dealing with challenges that never make the news. When those people buy a ticket to a comedy show, they're not always searching for another heavy conversation. Sometimes they're searching for relief. For one evening where they can laugh without feeling weighed down by everything waiting for them outside the theater. She explained that creating that kind of experience wasn't easier. If anything, she believed it demanded incredible discipline. Making an audience laugh without relying on constant controversy required careful writing, strong storytelling, and an honest connection with the people sitting in front of you. Every joke had to earn its laugh. Every story had to feel authentic. There were no shortcuts. As she continued, the audience seemed increasingly captivated. The discussion had become thoughtful rather than confrontational. People weren't simply watching two television personalities disagree. They were listening to two very different philosophies about what entertainment should accomplish. Leanne reflected on the countless conversations she'd had with audience members after her performances. Many didn't talk about specific jokes. Instead, they spoke about how much lighter they felt walking out of the theater than they had walking in. To her, those moments represented something deeply meaningful. If laughter could help someone carry life's burdens a little more easily, then she believed comedy had already achieved something extraordinary. She looked around the room before continuing. Success, she said, isn't measured only by awards, glowing reviews, or critical praise. It's also measured by the people who return year after year because your work has become part of their lives. The families who make attending your shows a tradition. The friends who introduce each other to your stories. The audience members who leave smiling because for a little while they forgot everything that had been weighing on them. Those moments mattered. Perhaps more than critics would ever realize. The studio remained remarkably quiet. Every sentence seemed to deepen the conversation rather than end it. Even those who had expected a heated argument now appeared focused on the ideas being exchanged rather than the disagreement itself. Leanne emphasized that comedy had never been one-size-fits-all. There was room for satire, room for observational humor, room for storytelling, room for clean comedy, and room for every performer willing to dedicate years to mastering their craft. The problem, she suggested, wasn't that different styles existed. The problem was assuming one style deserved more respect than another simply because it appealed to different audiences. That observation seemed to resonate throughout the studio. Several audience members nodded quietly. Others applauded before she had even finished speaking. By now, the conversation had taken on a momentum of its own. What had started as an unexpected question had become a much larger discussion about creativity, respect, and whether success should be judged by critics' opinions or by the millions of people who continue to support an artist year after year. And as Joy prepared to answer once again, it was becoming increasingly clear that neither woman intended to change her position. The debate was only growing more intense, and everyone in the studio could sense that its most dramatic moments were still ahead. By now, the discussion had reached a point where it was no longer just an exchange between two people sitting at the table. The entire studio had become part of the conversation. Only minutes earlier, the audience had been reacting the way daytime television audiences usually do, with light laughter, polite applause, and quiet attention. Now, everything felt different. People weren't simply listening anymore. They were choosing sides. As Leanne finished explaining why her comedy meant so much to ordinary families, applause began spreading across the room. At first it was scattered, almost hesitant, as though people weren't sure whether they should interrupt the conversation. Then more voices joined in. Within seconds, the applause became impossible to ignore. It wasn't the kind of reaction given to a clever joke or a rehearsed line. It sounded genuine. People weren't applauding because they had been told to. They were responding because something Leanne had said had clearly connected with them on a personal level. Joy waited for the room to settle before trying to continue, but the atmosphere had already changed. For the first time since the interview began, it felt as though Leanne was no longer answering questions. She was speaking directly to everyone watching. That shift was impossible to miss. The audience leaned forward, listening carefully to every word. Some nodded in agreement before she had even finished her sentences. Others exchanged quiet glances, recognizing the experiences Leanne had been describing. Many of them had likely known what it felt like to work long hours, care for families, or simply look for a few moments of laughter at the end of a difficult week. Her stories didn't sound distant. They sounded familiar. The other hosts also appeared increasingly thoughtful. Rather than interrupting, they allowed the conversation to continue naturally. Their expressions suggested they understood that this was no longer an ordinary celebrity interview. The discussion had become something much bigger than promoting a television project. Leanne wasn't defending a single performance. She was defending an entire audience that she believed had often been overlooked. Joy attempted to bring the conversation back to her original point, explaining that questioning public figures was part of the show's format and that different opinions naturally belonged in discussions about entertainment. Leanne acknowledged that everyone was entitled to an opinion. She wasn't asking anyone to agree with her style of comedy. She simply believed audiences should never be made to feel as though the things they enjoyed were somehow less meaningful than someone else's preferences. That distinction seemed to resonate throughout the room. Another round of applause followed. This time it arrived even faster. The audience wasn't reacting to confrontation. They were reacting to authenticity. As the discussion continued, it became increasingly clear that Leanne had shifted the focus away from herself. Instead of making the interview about personal criticism, she had turned it into a conversation about respect for different audiences, different artists, and different ways of making people laugh. That perspective seemed to unite many people in the studio. The energy had become noticeably warmer whenever Leanne spoke. Every answer felt measured. Every response remained calm. There were no raised voices, no dramatic outbursts, just steady confidence built on years of experience. Ironically, that calmness seemed to strengthen her position even further. The more composed she remained, the more carefully people listened. Joy, meanwhile, continued trying to explain her perspective, but each response seemed to bring the conversation back to the same central question. Who decides what real comedy looks like? Critics? Television personalities? or the millions of people who choose to spend their time and money supporting the comedians they love? No one in the studio offered an immediate answer. But judging by the audience's reaction, many had already reached their own conclusions. The interview had completely transformed. The friendly promotional appearance from the beginning of the program felt like a distant memory. Now, every sentence carried weight. Every reply shifted the atmosphere a little more. And as the discussion continued to build, it became clear that the emotional peak of the conversation was still waiting just ahead. As the applause slowly faded, Leanne didn't use the moment to celebrate herself. Instead, she shifted the focus somewhere else entirely. She explained that the conversation had never really been about her. It was about the millions of people who had supported her throughout her career. The people who often felt invisible whenever conversations about entertainment took place. She said that whenever critics dismissed her style of comedy, it wasn't just her work they were questioning. Whether intentionally or not, they were also dismissing the audience that chose to spend their evenings laughing with her. That, she admitted, was the part she found hardest to accept. Leanne spoke with the same calm sincerity that had carried her through the entire interview. She said she had spent years traveling across the country, meeting people from every walk of life. Teachers, nurses, truck drivers, factory workers, small business owners, parents raising children while balancing demanding jobs, grandparents helping hold families together, people whose names would never appear in headlines, but whose stories mattered just as much. Those were the people she thought about every time she stepped onto a stage. Not critics, not awards, not industry recognition. The people sitting in the audience. She explained that many of them worked incredibly hard every single day. They faced responsibilities that left little time for themselves, yet they still found a way to gather with friends and family for an evening of laughter. To her, that trust was something she could never take for granted. She said those audiences didn't ask for perfection. They didn't expect celebrities to impress them with complicated ideas or endless controversy. They simply wanted honesty. They wanted stories that reminded them they weren't alone in dealing with life's everyday challenges. Leanne smiled as she reflected on the countless conversations she'd had after performances over the years. People rarely approached her to discuss the mechanics of comedy or debate artistic theories. Instead, they shared pieces of their own lives. A mother would talk about raising teenagers. A retired couple would laugh about the little disagreements that came with decades of marriage. Someone would describe bringing 3 generations of their family to the same show because everyone could enjoy it together. Those moments, she explained, meant everything to her. She believed comedy should create connections, not just between the performer and the audience, but among the audience members themselves. For a few hours, strangers could laugh at the same stories and realize they had more in common than they imagined. That, in her eyes, was one of the most powerful things entertainment could accomplish. Leanne then addressed a broader idea. She said that people living outside major entertainment centers sometimes felt as though their experiences were treated as less important simply because they weren't part of the conversations happening in big cities. But ordinary lives were filled with extraordinary stories. Families everywhere celebrated victories, faced disappointments, helped neighbors, supported friends, and found reasons to laugh despite the pressures of daily life. Those experiences deserved to be represented too. She wasn't trying to speak for everyone. She simply wanted audiences like hers to know that their stories mattered, that they deserved comedians who understood their lives without asking them to become someone else first. As she continued, the audience listened with complete attention. The room had grown remarkably quiet. Every sentence carried the feeling of someone speaking from years of personal experience, rather than trying to win an argument. Leanne emphasized that success had never required her to abandon the people who believed in her from the beginning. There had been opportunities to change her style, suggestions to become more controversial, advice to follow whatever happened to be popular at the moment. But every time she considered those ideas, she returned to the same question. Would the people who had supported her for decades still recognize the person standing on stage? If the answer was no, then no amount of success would be worth it. She explained that staying authentic wasn't always the easiest path. Sometimes it meant waiting longer for opportunities. Sometimes it meant hearing that she wasn't the kind of comedian the industry wanted. Sometimes it meant watching others rise more quickly while she quietly continued doing the work. But she never regretted the decision. Because authenticity, once earned, creates something far more valuable than temporary popularity. It creates trust. And trust cannot be manufactured overnight. As those words settled over the studio, another wave of applause filled the room. This time, it lasted even longer. The reaction wasn't directed at a single statement. It reflected appreciation for everything Leanne had been saying since the conversation began. She had transformed a discussion about comedy into something much broader. A reminder that success doesn't require abandoning your values, your audience, or the people who believed in you before anyone else did. By now, the atmosphere inside the studio was unmistakably different from where the interview had started. The questions were no longer driving the conversation. Leanne's message was, and with every passing minute, it became increasingly difficult to predict how the interview could possibly return to the lighthearted tone it had begun with. By this stage of the interview, the atmosphere had changed so dramatically that it barely resembled the friendly conversation from the opening minutes. Every answer seemed to carry more weight than the one before it. Every pause felt longer. Every word was being measured carefully by everyone in the studio. Joy recognized that the discussion had drifted far from its original purpose. Instead of promoting Leanne's latest projects, the interview had become a larger conversation about comedy, respect, and the relationship between entertainers and their audiences. She attempted to guide the discussion back toward a more controlled direction. Speaking calmly, Joy explained that questioning guests was simply part of her role. She said interviews weren't meant to be comfortable all the time, and asking difficult questions didn't necessarily mean she was attacking anyone personally. From her perspective, public figures should be prepared to explain their work when those questions arise. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the conversation might settle. Leanne listened without interrupting. She nodded respectfully, allowing Joy to finish every point before responding. When she finally spoke, her tone remained remarkably composed. She agreed that interviews should include honest questions. She wasn't asking for special treatment. She wasn't expecting every conversation to be filled with praise. But she believed there was an important difference between challenging someone's ideas and questioning the legitimacy of everything they had spent decades building. That distinction, she explained, mattered. Because words have consequences. When someone with a large platform suggests that a certain kind of comedy is somehow less valuable, it doesn't stop with the performer sitting in front of them. It shapes how audiences view entire groups of artists. It influences how new comedians believe they have to perform in order to be taken seriously. And it sends a message that only certain voices deserve recognition. Leanne admitted she had heard those messages throughout her career. She had been told that her stories were too ordinary, too family-oriented, too gentle, too different from what many people expected successful stand-up comedy to be. Yet despite hearing those opinions for years, audiences continued proving that there was room for many different styles. That, she believed, should be celebrated rather than questioned. Joy responded by explaining that public conversations often involve disagreement and that differing opinions help create meaningful discussions. Leanne smiled softly before answering. She said disagreement itself had never been the problem. People can disagree respectfully every single day. The problem begins when disagreement quietly turns into dismissal. When someone's work is judged as less meaningful simply because it appeals to a different audience. She explained that entertainment isn't a competition where only one style deserves to exist. Different performers connect with different people for different reasons. That's what makes the industry diverse. Not everyone wants the same experience. Not everyone leaves a show looking for the same feeling. Some audiences enjoy sharp political humor. Others enjoy deeply personal storytelling. Others simply want to laugh about everyday life before returning to work the next morning. None of those audiences are wrong. As she continued, the audience remained completely silent. It was the kind of silence that comes when people are genuinely listening rather than waiting for someone to finish speaking. The other hosts also appeared increasingly thoughtful. Rather than interrupting or steering the discussion elsewhere, they allowed the exchange to unfold naturally. The conversation had taken on a life of its own. Joy made one more attempt to clarify her position, emphasizing that her questions were intended to spark thoughtful discussion rather than offend. Leanne acknowledged that explanation with a nod. She said intentions certainly matter, but so do outcomes. If people leave a conversation feeling as though their experiences, values, or preferred forms of entertainment have been dismissed, then it's worth asking whether the conversation achieved what it was supposed to. Her words landed quietly, but powerfully. There was no dramatic gesture, no raised voice, no attempt to dominate the room. Just calm confidence supported by decades of experience. Ironically, the more composed Leanne remained, the more difficult it became for anyone to portray her as defensive. She wasn't reacting emotionally. She was explaining her perspective with clarity and conviction. By now, the audience's attention had shifted almost entirely toward her. Every response she gave seemed to deepen the discussion rather than end it. What had begun as an ordinary interview was now moving toward a moment where neither side appeared willing to change course. The tension wasn't created by shouting. It was created by two completely different views of success, creativity, and respect standing face to face. And as the conversation continued, everyone in the studio could sense that the emotional breaking point was rapidly approaching. By now, it was obvious to everyone that this conversation had reached a point of no return. The cheerful atmosphere from the beginning of the interview had completely disappeared. No one was laughing anymore. No one was treating the discussion like another routine television debate. Every person in the studio understood they were witnessing a moment that had taken on a life of its own. The silence between each response seemed to grow longer. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that happens when every word matters. Joy took a deep breath before speaking again. She explained that her questions had never been intended to disrespect Leanne personally. She insisted that challenging public figures was part of her job and that conversations about comedy naturally involved different opinions. She emphasized that disagreement should never be mistaken for hostility. Leanne listened carefully. She didn't interrupt. She didn't roll her eyes. She simply waited until Joy had finished before offering one final response. And somehow, that calmness made the moment even more powerful. Leanne explained that she understood the importance of difficult conversations. She had spent enough years in entertainment to know that not everyone would appreciate her work. Criticism came with the profession. Different opinions came with success. That was never the issue. The issue, she said, was respect. She explained that there was a difference between questioning someone's work and questioning whether their success had real value. After spending decades earning the trust of audiences across the country, hearing those accomplishments reduced to a debate over whether they counted as real comedy felt deeply disappointing. Not because it hurt her feelings, but because it overlooked the people who had made that journey possible. Leanne paused for a moment before continuing. She said she often thought about the people sitting in her audiences. People who worked long hours before finding time to attend a comedy show. Parents trying to create happy memories with their children. Couples celebrating anniversaries. Friends reconnecting after months apart. Grandparents laughing alongside younger generations. Those weren't statistics. Those were real people. Real lives. Real stories. She explained that whenever she stepped onto a stage, those were the people she wanted to serve. Not critics. Not award panels. Not industry insiders. The audience. That simple statement seemed to settle over the room with unexpected weight. Several audience members quietly applauded before the rest joined in. The applause wasn't loud this time. It was steady, almost reflective. Joy waited for it to end before attempting one final clarification. She acknowledged Leanne's connection with her audience, but maintained that discussing different approaches to comedy remained a fair topic for public conversation. Leanne nodded. "I agree," she said calmly. "Different approaches deserve to be discussed." She paused again. But different approaches also deserve equal respect. Those few words immediately captured everyone's attention. Leanne continued by explaining that no performer succeeds for 25 years by accident. Audiences don't continue buying tickets decade after decade because of luck. They return because they find something meaningful. Whether that's laughter, hope, comfort, or simply a chance to forget life's pressures for a little while. That connection, she argued, couldn't be measured solely through critical opinion. It had to be measured through the people who kept showing up. The room remained completely still. Even the smallest sounds seemed amplified by the silence. The other hosts exchanged thoughtful glances but said nothing. The conversation had reached a point where interruptions no longer felt appropriate. Everyone simply listened. Leanne admitted that she never expected every person to enjoy her comedy. No artist could appeal to everyone. That wasn't realistic. What mattered was respecting the fact that different audiences searched for different experiences. Some people left a comedy show wanting to debate ideas. Others left grateful that they had laughed harder than they had in months. Neither reaction was more valuable than the other. Both represented meaningful experiences. As she finished speaking, another wave of applause spread through the audience. This time it lasted noticeably longer. Not because anyone had declared a winner. Not because one side had completely defeated the other. But because many people recognized that the conversation had moved beyond personal disagreement. It had become a discussion about respecting different voices, different audiences, and different paths to success. Joy remained quiet for several moments. For the first time since the discussion began, there seemed to be no immediate response. The studio waited. The audience waited. Even Leanne remained silent. The tension had reached its highest point. Everyone sensed that whatever happened next would determine how the interview would be remembered. And as the silence stretched across the studio, it became clear that the conversation was about to reach its dramatic conclusion. The conversation had reached a point where neither side seemed likely to change the other's mind. For a long moment, the studio remained completely silent. Leanne looked across the table, then toward the audience, taking a slow breath before speaking one last time. "I think we've both said what we came here to say," she said calmly. "And sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is recognize when a conversation has reached its natural end." There was no anger in her voice. No shouting. Just quiet certainty. She explained that everyone was entitled to an opinion, but she also believed people had the right to protect their own peace when a discussion stopped being productive. "I've spent my career trying to leave people happier than I found them," she continued. "That's still how I'd like to leave this conversation." The audience remained completely still, listening to every word. Leanne thanked the viewers who had supported her throughout the years and said their encouragement had carried her through every challenge of her career. She smiled warmly. "No interview can define 25 years of hard work," she said. "That story was written one audience at a time." With that, she stepped away from the table. The studio watched quietly as the moment settled in. The remaining hosts exchanged thoughtful looks, realizing the discussion had become much bigger than anyone had expected. For everyone present, the interview would be remembered not for who won an argument, but for the reminder that success can take many different forms, and that people don't have to agree to respect one another. The conversation ended, but the questions it raised continued long after the cameras stopped rolling. It didn't take long for the fictional confrontation to become the biggest topic of conversation online. Within hours, social media users were sharing clips, debating every exchange, and offering completely different interpretations of what had happened. Some believed Leanne had stood her ground with remarkable composure, while others felt the discussion simply reflected two very different philosophies about comedy. Entertainment commentators began weighing in as well. Some argued that the conversation highlighted a growing divide over what audiences expect from comedians. Others suggested it was a reminder that there is room in entertainment for many different styles, from observational storytelling to satire, and everything in between. Fans of Leanne praised her calm approach throughout the exchange. They admired the way she explained her perspective without raising her voice, believing that her confidence came from years of experience rather than the need to win an argument. Meanwhile, supporters of Joy defended the idea that interviewers should be free to ask challenging questions, even when those questions make guests uncomfortable. They argued that difficult conversations often lead to meaningful discussions and that public figures naturally face scrutiny. As the debate continued, one thing became clear. The conversation had grown far beyond a single television interview. People were discussing larger questions about entertainment itself. What makes comedy meaningful? Should every comedian be judged by the same standards? Can making people feel comfortable be just as valuable as making them uncomfortable? Those questions inspired thousands of conversations across online communities. In the days that followed, viewers continued revisiting the discussion, each bringing their own experiences and opinions. Some identified with Leanne's emphasis on connection and everyday life. Others appreciated the importance of challenging conversations in comedy. There was no universal agreement, and perhaps that was the most interesting outcome of all. The fictional interview became less about who was right or wrong, and more about how audiences define success, authenticity, and the purpose of laughter. Even as news stories began replacing it in the news cycle, people continued returning to the debate, proving that sometimes the most memorable conversations are the ones that leave room for different perspectives rather than simple answers. Whether people sided with Leanne, agreed with Joy, or found themselves somewhere in the middle, one thing was impossible to ignore. The conversation had become about far more than a single interview. It had turned into a broader discussion about success, respect, and the many different ways artists connect with audiences. For years, Leanne had built her career by remaining true to herself. She never claimed her style of comedy was the only approach that mattered. Instead, she focused on telling stories that reflected everyday life and creating a space where audiences could laugh together. Others believed comedy served a different purpose: to challenge assumptions, encourage debate, or push creative boundaries. Those ideas don't have to cancel each other out. In fact, the world of entertainment is large enough for both. The fictional exchange reminds us that two talented people can view the same art form through completely different lenses without proving that one perspective is the only correct one. Perhaps that's the real takeaway. Every audience is different. Every performer has a unique voice. And every successful career is built in its own way. At the end of the day, millions of people choose the comedians who speak to them personally. Some are looking for satire. Some enjoy observational humor. Others simply want to leave a show smiling after a difficult week. None of those choices are wrong. That's what makes comedy so diverse. Whether a comedian fills a small local theater or performs in front of thousands, the goal remains the same: to create a genuine connection with the audience. And maybe that's the measure that matters most. So what do you think? If this fictional scenario had happened, how would you have reacted? Do you think there is room for every style of comedy, or should some approaches receive more recognition than others? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this fictional entertainment story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future celebrity-inspired stories and discussions. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.